Hi, I'm the Reverend Kate Spellman, your guest preacher at St. Simon's on Sunday, June 21st. Although I'm an ordained Episcopal priest with many years of parish experience, right now I work in the secular social service world. I work with Age Options, which is the area agency on aging for suburban Cook County. I run all of our older adult programming for the LGBT community. So today I've made this brief video to introduce you to this population and talk a little bit about some of the work that I do. So first of all, you may not be familiar with the term older adult. It's not just a euphemism that we use to avoid terms like senior or elderly that some people find insulting. This phrase is based on the Older Americans Act, which was passed in 1965. In 1965, when you turned 60, that was quite an accomplishment and probably time to think about or start enjoying your retirement. These days, when we think of an older adult, we probably think of someone who looks much more like Archbishop Tutu on the left here. He's turning 88 this year. But by my calculations, our bishop, Jeffrey Lee, is also an older adult. He's probably just about 60. Maybe you were shocked when you heard that he was planning on retirement because he seems so lively, so active, so eager to have a whole new chapter. But he too is an older adult. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are markedly different life expectancies for different groups of people in the United States, and perhaps especially in Chicago. Depending on the zip code that they live in, someone who looks like Archbishop Tutu and somebody who looks like our bishop, Jeff Lee, probably have life expectancies that differ by about 20 years. Some of the populations I live with have such markedly lower life expectancies that when they turn 50, we begin considering them older adults. These include people with long-term AIDS or HIV infections, as well as transgender individuals. So talking about LGBT older adults always means we're talking about intersectionality. I hope this is a phrase that you're somewhat familiar with. It's credited often to legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who did in fact talk about it as kind of being the intersection, like a traffic stop intersection. This is because people can live at the point where many different marginalized identities connect. Identity is always complex and multi-layered. Our identities are as unique as we are because they're made up of all the different strands that go into how we think about and how we describe ourselves. I've used the original pride flag for this slide. It's one that you may not have seen before with two more stripes, the pink and the aqua stripe, than we see on most pride flags today. I also wanted to talk about the fact that these terms and these identity markers change and shift over time. We're celebrating this year the 51st anniversary of the first real step of modern gay liberation, the Stonewall riots in New York City. The Stonewall riots and the following movement were led in part by women we would now call transgender, including Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. But they didn't use this terminology to describe themselves. Rivera often referred to herself as a transvestite, and Marsha P. Johnson often identified as a drag queen. Transvestite is now an insulting term that we would not use in working with older adults. That's just a signal of how times and our understanding of things like gender identity shift and change. Another shift that we're kind of in the middle of right now is whether or not we include the letter Q. When I work with older adults, I don't, because that Q often stands for the word queer, and many older adults carry intense trauma from their growing up years when they were tormented by schoolyard bullies who used that term as a slur against them. Many people who work in this sphere with me actually think that in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll start putting the Q back on all of our stuff. So we'll have to reorder all of our stationery and business cards to show how we are shifting and changing with the times. So who are our older LGBT adults? Well, we know that there are at least 3 million of them in the United States today. And it's important to remember that this is a really low estimate. This is self-reported data, and I think actually only includes lesbian and gay individuals, so not members of the community who identify as bisexual or transgender. Still, if we take this 3 million figure into account, by 2050, based on population growth, there'll be about 7 million older LGBT adults in the country. 20% of these folks today are people of color, and by 2050, this will rise to about 40%. Again, these are people who are living at the intersection of many different identities. Older LGBT adults today are twice as likely to be unpartnered, which means they may be living alone, and they're 4 times less likely to have children than their heterosexual or cisgender peers. This is really significant because children are often one of the resources that people draw on as they age for help in informal care or managing their formal care. This leaves LGBT older adults especially susceptible to social isolation, which is exactly what it sounds like. A lack of social ties leads to really bad health outcomes, and apparently is as bad for your physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It can lower your life expectancy again and lead to all kinds of problems. The last thing I want to point out is that we often think of LGBT people as living mostly in city centers, but a recent study by the AARP, or ARP as they like to be called now, found that about a quarter of LGBT older adults live in the suburbs of these cities. An additional quarter live in rural contexts, and about 20% in smaller cities. About a third do live in city centers, but turns out that's not even a majority of people. I want to do a very quick case study with you of someone that I'm going to call Jan. Jan is not a real person. This is not an image of someone I work with. It's something I pulled off of Google Images of a stock photo. And for the purposes of this, we're going to assume that Jan is cisgender. That means she identifies as the gender that was marked on her birth certificate, and that she's white, middle-aged, and relatively healthy. Let's say that she was born in 1950, so she's turning 70 at some point this year. Now, before Jan was born in the 1940s, we now know that there were many, many LGBT people who were put to death in Nazi concentration camps. And in the 50s, when Jan was a little girl, the charge of homosexuality was something that was used to purge a number of individuals from US government positions. Maybe Jan wasn't fully conscious of this, as she would have been quite small, but all of it went into creating an environment for Jan when she was growing up, where she probably started to learn and observe quite early that her identity could get her killed, or at least make her unsafe in the wider world. In the 1960s, Jan would have witnessed and possibly even participated in the civil rights movement. And in 1969, she would have seen those Stonewall riots that I mentioned earlier kick off the modern gay rights movement. Maybe she even participated in them if she was living in or around New York City. But it was not until 1973, when she was 23, that Jan would have seen the homosexuality taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association as a diagnosis. This sounds really abstract until you consider, again, all of the very real implications that a diagnosis like this could have had for somebody's life. In addition to being fired from a job, Jan could have been institutionalized and given therapy against her will. And if she was involved in a custody case with any children, this charge was often used to brand people as unfit parents and to take their children away from them. In the 1980s, Jan would have seen or been a part of the HIV epidemic. And if you're thinking to yourself that you see some parallels between our current pandemic and the epidemic in the 1980s, you're not the only person. Folks who lived through this epidemic often came away with real distrust of government or even medical authorities, which continues to complicate their care until this day. People who survived this epidemic often struggle with survivor's guilt as well. There are some older LGBT adults that I work with who remember what it was like to go to at least one funeral a week for years upon years, maybe even a decade. In the 1990s, Jan would have seen the Defense of Marriage Act passed and the beginnings of the real struggles for legal recognition of marriages. By the 2000s, these legal struggles were really heating up. The Defense of Marriage Act and Don't Ask, Don't Tell were both repealed, but it was not until 2003 that the Supreme Court struck down the last laws criminalizing homosexual acts. And not until 2015 that marriages became federally recognized. And it was not until 2020, earlier this week, that we had our first federally recognized anti-discrimination policies. Jan, at the ripe age of 70, is finally safe from being fired because of who she is. But she's not safe in being protected from housing discrimination or many of the other forms of discrimination that have probably marked her life. So in the end, Jan has seen a tremendous amount of progress in her 70 years, but she probably carries with her many of those lessons that she started to learn as a little girl. She's learned that she may not be safe or welcome in every environment. And for many of our older LGBT adults, these, we call it minority stress, And these continued experiences of discrimination have really negative associations and really bad outcomes for them. A lifetime of discrimination may have meant a lower salary. We see this especially with lesbian and bisexual women, and often fewer or less retirement savings. Longtime partners whose unions were not legally recognized may not have been able to give each other access to benefits. So let's say Jan was partnered for 40 years. When her partner passed away, she may not have been able to get access to her partner's pension benefits or any of her partner's retirement savings. Also, if Jan was partnered but did not work outside of the home and her partnership was not legally recognized, she would not be eligible for Medicare under her spouse's work history. This is the only way that many of our older adults can afford any of the treatments or life-saving medical procedures that they need. Many older LGBT adults continue to face discrimination when they seek long-term care or retirement housing, and they also speak about how difficult it is to live with the other residents of these facilities. There's often really intense bullying. You remember from earlier when I talked about the gentleman I know who remembers the Q word being used against him. He's very afraid that as he ages, he'll have to go into a facility where he'll have to go back into the closet or deal with that kind of bullying again. Folks also deal with the history of a lack of competent or affirming care. As many as I think a third of LGBT older adults are not out to their medical providers, which means that they may not be getting the care that they need with the care that they deserve. And this, as I talked about when I talked about Jan's experience in the 1980s, this history of exclusion may lead them to distrust the medical establishment, to delay getting care, or not to be compliant with a physician's recommendations. I talked too about the effects of social isolation, which affects not only older adults themselves, but their caregivers as well. Because older adults are often socially isolated, because they may not have a partner or may not have children, we often find that an older LGBT adult has only one caregiver in their life, which means there's a tremendous amount of stress on that caregiver. Older LGBT adults are also actually more likely to be caregivers themselves. As their parents age, sometimes they are the only sibling who doesn't have a partner or children to take care of, and they end up stepping into that responsibility. We see lots of effects of stress with all of our caregivers across the population, but LGBT folks are perhaps especially susceptible to that kind of stress. All of this adds up to some pretty difficult health statistics. There are markedly poor physical health outcomes, and older LGBT adults tend to report feeling worse in terms of their mental health as well. Some of this minority stress and stigma, of course, leads to things like self-medication with drugs or alcohol and other risky behaviors as well. I do want to say that this is not an entirely bleak picture, right? LGBT older adults, or elders, as we call them in the community, are often the bedrock of their chosen families, these bonds that are based not on biology or legal ties, but on affinity and true care for each other. This is also a community that shares a history of resilience and advocacy, that knows what it means to come together and fight for your own rights and those of each other. It's a wonderful community that's full of incredible stories, and selfishly, that's why I enjoy this work so much. So what can we do to become more welcoming to older LGBT adults? A lot of these are things you've already heard before. It's important to visually signal welcome with a pride flag, a triangle marking a safe space, maybe putting your preferred pronouns on name tags whenever you actually get back into the church. It's important to note, though, that this may not make older LGBT adults fully comfortable coming out. They may simply enjoy knowing that they're safe or that they're welcomed into a space without wanting to really acknowledge who they are or all the different parts of their identities. Think again about Jan and all of the discrimination that she's faced in her life. She may simply feel that she wants to keep her identity to herself or fly under the radar because she's had so many experiences of being picked out or picked on because of who she is. It's important to remember that the burden is on us to show older adults that they are welcome. There are people who are probably going to assume that they're not welcome because they have been for so long. I also want to urge you to consider this as a learning process. You can always ask a polite question. You can always ask Google a question. And I have some resources on my next and final slide to give you places to go for more information. If you make a mistake with somebody's gender or identity marker, simply apologize and move on. We are all learning together in this sphere. And the fact that you're willing and showing yourself willing really means a lot to the people that we serve. So here are some places you could go for resources or for more information. First off is SAGE, which stands for Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders. They are a New York-based organization where they do lots of direct service to clients, but they have an advocacy and educational wing that covers all of the United States and actually does some international partnerships as well. What's great about this organization is that they also run a 24/7 hotline, now in English and Spanish, which older LGBT adults and caregivers can call at any time, day or night. They do crisis counseling, they do referrals, and they're also just willing to stay on the phone so that someone has someone friendly to talk to at the other end of the line. The National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, which is lgbtagingcenter.org, has all kinds of reports and documentations, as well as helpful guides on how to become more welcoming or issues to think about. There's a lot on that website. So if you find yourself just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, just know that you have to wade through a bunch of different PDFs, but all the stuff that they have on there is really good and really strong. Most of the statistics that I cited in this report, as well as way more, can be found in this Movement Advancement Project report, which I've linked to as well. This is a 30-page document. So if you want to see in black and white some of the health disparities that I mentioned, this is a good place to get started. Finally, I put my contact information, my email if you want to reach out if you have any questions, if you're going to miss Sunday but wanted to ask a follow-up, as well as the website for my particular program. Again, we only cover suburban Cook County, but if you or someone you know lives in a different one of our counties or in the city of Chicago, you can also feel free to contact me and I'm happy to refer you somewhere else. So that's my presentation. I won't have slides on Sunday, although I guess I could reshare these if you found them just so captivating that you want to take another look. But I'm looking forward to more conversation. This is a learning process for me as well, and I'm happy to do research or come back to you if there's something that I can't answer. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Bye-bye.